Yeah, that's better, right? Okay, good. So, happy to see so many faces here today. So many students. Great of you to come. I hope you enjoy this session. I'm sure I will. We have the pleasure of having Nick Groom here, Dr. Nick Groom from the University of Exeter, an internationally renowned specialist on Gothic literature, on Chatterton, on issues of English identity, culture, and so on and so forth. Nick has taught at the universities of Oxford, Bristol, Stanford, and Chicago, apart from Exeter, obviously, where he is based. And he's currently a professor in English at this University of Exeter and co-director of the Exeter Center for Literatures of Identity, Place, and Sustainability, meaning that he is also engaging in issues of ecological culture and especially related to literature. Now, he has written widely in both the academic and popular press. Among his books are two studies of national identity, the Union Jack that he published in 2006 about the flag and the implications of that flag for national identity, and The Seasons. This is a book that you can find also out here in the stand on the table. In 2013, and this book was shortlisted for the Catherine Briggs Folklore Award and a runner-up for Countryfile Book of the Year, as well as a short introduction also to the Gothic in this series from the Oxford University Press. Very, very succinct, very, very well summarized, and I think it's an essential reading for anyone even remotely interested in the Gothic, not only in literature but also in history and in culture. Last year, Oxford University Press published its anniversary edition of the Gothic novel The Castle of Otranto. And he has another two editions in press also for Oxford, The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis and The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, that will be published this year, next year? 2016. Nick has been interested in Tolkien since before he was an undergraduate. And his first publication was in the newsletter of the Tolkien Society when he was aged 14 years old. So he's been around a while in Tolkien studies. He now teaches the only undergraduate course, the module on Tolkien in the UK at Exeter, right? Yeah. And he had an essay in Stuart Lee's Blackwell Companion to Tolkien that was published last year, among many other things that he continuously publishes on many different issues. So, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Nick Groom here today. He will be giving his talk on the Gothic, the Nation, and the Inklings. So, whenever you're ready, Nick, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Martin. I'm delighted to be here. It's my first time in the Basque Country, and I'm very pleased to be at this inaugural conference organised by Martin, Raoul, and the team here. So thank you. Now, this paper develops my thinking about Tolkien and his relationship with English literature. I'm attempting to unravel further Tolkien's relationship with his use of Gothic motifs of national identity. And my own particular account of the Gothic is historicist. By which I mean I'm looking at the cultural and political understandings of the term, rather than taking, say, a psychoanalytic or semiological approach. I'm arguing that the Gothic is a characteristically English style of literature, architecture, art, and folklore that emerges from politicised cultural identities or cultural memories, that it's a distinctive imaginative response to history, which is developed in which antiquity is being perceived as haunted and ruinous, remote from modern society, and yet responsible for and indeed potentially present everywhere in modern society. So the Gothic imagination is consequently a reminder of historical progress and also at the same time a lament for the lost past. It's a guarded suppression of the violence of history that's nevertheless led to the present day. And I'll be talking about this in more detail in the next few minutes. One of the reasons that I'm particularly pleased to be here is to learn more about Spanish cultural attitudes to the Visigothic, the Visigothos kingdoms, and how that cultural inheritance might have influenced Spanish identity. So I'm therefore seeking to go deeper than simply talking about the macabre, the mysterious, the monstrous, the magical. What I'm trying to argue is that, at least in England, the Gothic was, and still is, a way of coming to terms with the processes of English and subsequently British and Irish history, which is why in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries it had strong political, social and theological significance. So it's from this perspective that I'll be approaching Tolkien's work, and I'm afraid I haven't got time to talk about C.S. Lewis as well, but maybe we can do that during the round table tomorrow. So I'll begin with a concise account of the history of the Gothic before suggesting some specific examples from Tolkien. So I'm arguing that placing Tolkien within this English Gothic tradition can cast new light on his work and the ways in which he uses history. Now, most people in at least the English-speaking world, you may disagree, would associate the Gothic with 18th and 19th century terror fiction, and the Goths themselves with a thriving subculture and musical style that's been around since about the 1980s. Now, this isn't me. When I showed it to my wife, she says, "Is that you?" No, it's not me, but it is at Whitby Goth Festival a year or two ago. I have been to the festival, but that's not me. Now, if asked further, some people would say, well, the Gothic's also a form of medieval architecture. And the Goths, Visigoths and Ostrogoths were ancient barbarian races who overran the Roman Empire, who might be associated with Attila the Hun and the discoveries at Sutton Hoo, which is the great ship burial excavated in England in the 1930s, exactly contemporary with Tolkien's work on The Hobbit. Now, all of these answers I've just given are broadly correct, but I want to concentrate on the middle part of that history, the 18th and 19th century connotations of Gothic and the Goths. The meaning of Gothic was highly perplexed, it was complicated in the 18th century, but strong threads, three strong threads are discernible. First, the Goths were defined as a Teutonic, as a Germanic tribe of the declining years of the Roman Empire, the period of late antiquity. Secondly, Gothic referred to a political theory derived from anti-classical values attributed to these barbarians. And thirdly, the term referred to the literature and especially the architecture of the Middle Ages and its revival in the cult of medievalism. So the Teutonic tribal Goths crossed the river Danube in AD 376 and by AD 410 had sacked Rome. So in the 5th century had sacked Rome. In the next century, the historian Jordanes, himself a Goth, provided his people with a rich theory of racial origins, far north of the Mediterranean. He described their migrations to a place called Scythia, which is in Eastern Europe on the edge of the Black Sea, and their current subsequent victory over the Romans. Now, historians and chroniclers then subsequently used the term Goth as a general term to cover the Germanic tribes, including the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes. Jutes, it was thought, was a corruption of the word Goth. So these are the Germanic tribes who then colonize, migrate to other parts of Europe. So in this version of ancient history, the Goths were imagined to be part of the genesis, part of the creation of the English nation. They'd landed there in AD 449, halfway through the 5th century, under the lords Hengist and Horsa, the horse lords. And this is how the word Gothic began to develop its later political implications. Now, these ancient Goths and their language pervade Tolkien's writing. He acquired Joseph Wright's Primer of the Gothic Language in 1908 and 1909, and by the 11th of March 1910 was speaking in Gothic at a debate at his school. The debates were conducted in Latin, but he was playing the part of a Goth and spoke in Gothic. His first invented language was a supplement to Gothic, Gothic as he called it, which was supposedly spoken by the Geats of Beowulf, after which he wrote a Gothic poem, a poem in the language of Gothic, to suggest what literature had been lost by the Gothic inheritance not surviving. And while an undergraduate, Tolkien attended Joseph Wright's lectures on Gothic grammar before lecturing on it himself. And he admitted, "Gothic was the first to take me by storm, to move my heart. It was the first of the old Germanic languages that I ever met. I've since mourned the loss of Gothic literature. I did not then. The contemplation of the vocabulary in a primer of the Gothic language was enough. A sensation at least as full of delight as first looking into Chapman's Homer, though I did not write a sonnet about it. I tried to invent Gothic words." Now, as you may recognise, the allusion there on first looking into Chapman's Homer is the romantic poet John Keats's sonnet with that title. And while Tolkien admits that he did not write a sonnet about Gothic, ultimately he endeavoured to recreate the entire culture. So early in his career, in the translation of Beowulf, which was published finally last year, which he made while at the University of Leeds, Tolkien equated the Geat people of Beowulf with the Goths and lectured on the legends of the Goths. They became woven into his mythology. Many commentators have pointed out that the people of Rohan have Gothic names, in particular the Rohirrim chieftains before the Aeol dynasty have Gothic names. And there was a tradition that Gothic meant horse folk. So the Rohirrim are not simply reinvented Anglo-Saxons, as we might commonly take them to be, but Goths. But indeed, Sandra Bailiff Strobhauer has argued that the marriage of Faramir to Éowyn at the end of The Lord of the Rings is reminiscent of the dynastic marriages between Romans and Goths in late antiquity. They're coming from different cultures, different peoples. And Appendix F of The Lord of the Rings also offers Gothic names for hobbits, such as Calimac Brandagamba for Meriadoc Brandybuck. Tom Shippey has pointed out that the Battle of the Pelennor Fields is based on the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought in AD 451 between the Romans and the Visigoths against the Huns supported by the Ostrogoths. Names in Tolkien's work The Lost Road are also taken from the Gothic, and the associated poem King Sheev is a Gothic myth. Most explicitly, the legend of Sigurd and Guthrun, Tolkien's version of which was published 2 or 3 years ago, assimilates the Gothic narrative poem in Heidrek Saga as the battle of the Goths and Huns. Moreover, in an unpublished lecture on the Goths, Tolkien wrote, "In vain we regret the past or speculate on what might have been, yet it is inevitable that we should regret. In dealing with the Goths, regret cannot be avoided. If not regret for what might have been, at any rate, regret for our altogether scanty records of what was, the vanishing of their tradition, literature, history, and most of their tongue." So rather than seeing the Goths as the barbarians who had brought about the collapse of the Roman Empire, Tolkien argued that the Romans had brought about the ruin of Gaul and the submergence of its native language or languages, arts and traditions, dooming to obscurity the debate and history of perhaps the most remarkable of the Cymric-speaking peoples. As is clear from Tolkien's own comments, the Gothic was, in effect, an alternative to classical civilization. And in this, he is echoing the work of earlier 16th and 17th century antiquarian historians. The Goths were barely mentioned throughout the Middle Ages, the medieval period. But by the Renaissance, Italian painters and architects began to denounce as Gothic everything not built in the Roman style. That included Neolithic standing stones and stone circles, as well as Romanesque and Norman churches and medieval cathedrals. It had the result of encouraging a wider interest in Gothic itself. So some 16th century antiquarians followed the Gothic historian Jordanes in arguing that the Goths not only originated in the north, but were the purest northern race and exemplified robust and hardy northern values. These historians suggested that the Goths displayed an instinctive love of liberty, and that it was this that had enabled them to overcome the tyranny of the oppressive and decadent Roman Empire. And further examples of the Gothic championing of history and of freedom were evident in English history, it was thought. And so the Gothic spirit was identified with great moments in the progress of the nation, where the people had demonstrated their Gothic roots by rebelling against imposed, especially foreign, authority. So the presentation of Magna Carta, which is the constitutional rights of the people, was seen as a challenge to Norman oppression, to the Norman conquest imposed after 1066, and was seen as a central instance of Gothic liberty being expressed in England. By the 17th century, then, the Gothic in England had developed into a theory of politics and history. It was anti-classical and anti-absolutist. In other words, it was anti-despotic power. One consequence of this growing emphasis is that later political debate in the 16th and 17th centuries was rooted in studies of the past. Not only did this research seek to establish where these ancient tribes had gone, what were the origins of racial identity, and what were the foundations of national character, but they also focused on key historical events, such as the crowning of William I, or William the Bastard, in 1066, to assess whether the Norman invasion of England had really been a conquest, or simply a way of replacing one Saxon ruler with another. These theories of what was called Gothic polity were developed by the parliamentarians, those who believed in Parliament over the authority of the king, in arguing against the attempts of Stuart kings such as Charles I to take more and more power. So Gothic polity, the government of the Goths, was thought to be constitutional monarchy and a feudal land management. It was seen as a government of free men. And it was a system of government, these historians suggested, that was shared by all of the northern nations, as well as by Poland, Hungary, and parts of Spain and Portugal. So this idea then formed the core of 18th century liberal thinking, and this is called the Whig Party, who held that Parliament and the people, democratic will of the people, had power over the king or the monarch. And it was also a way of endorsing, of supporting their own values of commerce and trade. In contrast to that, and returning to the values of the Renaissance, were the Royalist Party, the Tories, the aristocrats, who favoured classical taste and attacked the Goths as barbaric, crude, destructive, obscure, and dark. So you have two different attitudes to the past here. And the Tory, the Royalist enthusiasm for classical literature and architecture, is seen perhaps most notably in the Duke of Buckingham's London house, built in 1705, which was acquired by the King George III in 1761 and is now known as Buckingham Palace. So a strong anti-Gothic narrative, in which the Goths are seen as degenerate, was being put forward by the royalist Tories at the same time as a pro-positive Gothic model was being advocated by the liberal Whigs. There's also a third strand to this thinking. The determined revival of classical culture in 18th century England was seen as neoclassical, and as a response to the political Gothicism of the Middle Ages. It's what we would today call medievalism. There was a revival in this interest and taste for the Middle Ages. And this movement influenced architecture, literature, drama, as well as social behaviour. Medieval cathedrals and castles inspired not only whole new building projects in the form of picturesque ruins in the gardens of aristocratic houses, but also interior decoration, furniture, and the gardens themselves. Gardening was seen as Gothic. And in fact, you can argue that the Gothic really begins in the garden. Estates began to allow little wild patches to grow, untended by the gardener. They were free from the tyranny of that gardening aesthetic, and were therefore seen as being symbolic of the spirit of liberty. The weeds were liberal, they were natural, they were growing up. And it also ties the Gothic to ideas of natural wilderness. Indoors, you could buy Gothic tables, chairs, and bedsteads. And I think the height of this trend is Strawberry Hill. There's a vast, rambling, mock medieval mansion built on the edge of London by Horace Walpole, youngest son of the Whig Prime Minister Robert Walpole. Work commenced in 1748. In literature and criticism, there was fresh interest in early English writers, from Geoffrey Chaucer to Edmund Spenser, and writers like Richard Hurd outlined the significance of medieval romance, and especially the virtues of chivalry for contemporary conduct and masculine behaviour in his letters on chivalry and romance. So all of this, the English Middle Ages, is seen as offering a model for a respectable life in 18th century England. Not everybody agreed. The literature was attacked, for example, by John Newbery, who said in 1762 that all this was absurd and unmeaning tales of giants, champions, enchanted knights, witches, goblins, and other such monstrous fictions and reveries as could only proceed from the grossest ignorance or a distempered brain. Now, despite the savagely disparaging tone, this is a clear agenda for what the Gothic is all about. It's anti-enlightenment, it's anti-rational. It's a revival of medieval romance. And for us here at this conference, Newbery also really summarises what Tolkien will be doing years later. Giants, champions, enchanted knights, witches and goblins. It's only really dragons and elves and hobbits that aren't included in this list. And in spite of this attack, Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill published 2 years later what's considered to be the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, 1764. The Otranto has all the features we've come to associate with Gothic novels. It's set in an ancient castle riddled with secret passages. It's haunted by old prophecies. There are bizarre supernatural events, and the place is populated by the walking dead. A lot of this is taken from Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, such as Shakespeare's Hamlet. And if Otranto and the Gothic literary genre can be said to have influenced Tolkien, there seems to be plenty of evidence here. Middle-earth is littered with ancient and ruined architecture. There are many subterranean episodes in passages under the misty mountains, in Moria, in the Paths of the Dead. There's prophecies in Isildur's Bane, for example, that motivates the Council of Elrond. The Lord of the Nazgul appears to be protected by a foretelling that he shall not be slain by any man. The dead walk in the shape of ringwraiths, barrow wights, and oathbreakers. And there's a strong influence, I think, from Elizabethan and Jacobean drama as well, notably Hamlet. The play Hamlet is characterised by northern doom. It's not a classical tragedy. And it's infused by dreams of self-doubt. And Tolkien was also influenced by Macbeth. Among other scenes and images provided the inspiration for the March of the Ents. If anybody's read Macbeth, they'll recognise that Tolkien's using that. Tolkien admitted as such. But it's only in the manifestation of supernatural events that Tolkien's stories fall short of the bizarre and extreme incidents that pepper Otranto. A giant helmet appears right at the beginning of the novel that crushes the little prince Conrad. Now, if Walpole's excesses can be excused, it was that he claimed that his new supernatural medievalism was itself inspired by dreams he had while living in his own castle. And Tolkien's work too, especially The Lord of the Rings, and narratives such as The Lost Road and the Notion Club papers, are pervaded by meaningful dreams. For Walpole, this was his attempt to evoke the sublime, as is defined by Edmund Burke in his Philosophical Inquiry, published in 1757. Now, this theory best expresses, I think, the impulse behind the Gothic passions. For Edmund Burke, the sublime experience was typified by the experience of terror and immense power, and this is heightened by obscurity. Obscurity allows the mind to engage with the infinite. It gives a sense of the limitations of the mind. So Burke writes that an immense mountain covered with a shining green turf is nothing in this respect to one dark and gloomy. The cloudy sky is more grand than the blue, and night more solemn and sublime than the day. And drawing on examples from English literature, Burke famously quoted John Milton, his description of death in Paradise Lost, with which some of you may be familiar. Now, I'll read this out because I think you can see very clear connections, I think, now with Tolkien. This is death. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance, might be called that shadow seemed. For each seemed either, black it stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a dreadful dart. What seemed his head the likeness of a kingly crown had on. Now, the manifestation of death in Paradise Lost has a real sort of horrid palpability, which is immediately recognisable to the reader of Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a book full of shadows, from the pitiless gloom of Moria, above them all as they lay hung the darkness, hollow and immense, to the suffocating blackness of Shelob's lair, from a knife in the dark to the coming of the great darkness, from the dreadful arrival of the ringwraiths, so black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them, and the confrontation between Gandalf and the Lord of the Nazgul, a great black shape grown to a vast menace of despair. The Witch King himself is like a compound of shadows and nothingness, very like Milton's account of death. In fact, the Witch King says, "This is my hour, do you not know death when you see it?" It's worth noting in passing that other Miltonic imagery also seeps into Tolkien's work. Milton's lurid depiction of sin, for instance. Sin is this female whose womb holds hellhounds. Lies, I think, behind this rather abject description of the female monster Shelob. She served none but herself, drinking the blood of elves and men, bloated and grown fat with endless brooding on her feasts, weaving webs of shadow. For all living things were her food, and her vomit darkness. Far and wide her lesser broods, bastards of the miserable mates, her own offspring that she slew. Likewise, Milton's account of the building of Pandemonium, the diabolical city, and the devil's invention of explosives and guns is reminiscent of the industrial model of Isengard and the orcs' love of wheels and engines and explosions. I'm not arguing that Tolkien was directly influenced by Milton, he might have been, but rather that his version of the sublime, of the power of obscurity, is recognisably Burkean. It's through Burke's understanding of Milton. And I think this is an important point for several reasons, which I'll outline and then go into in a little more depth. For Burke, Walpole and later Gothic writers, the sublime signalled the limits of rationality. This is, of course, Goya, the sleep of reason. And it was best communicated by the obscure. So the profoundly suggestive obscurity of terror and power became a crucial activity of the Gothic imagination. And Burke's work is almost like a manifesto, almost like an agenda for later Gothic writers. And I've proposed 7 types of obscurity that exemplify Gothic aesthetics, which I'll give you in a moment. It's also important to understand that the sublime became a fundamental constituent of a particularly political form of literature, of the Whig party, the Liberal party. So this way of writing wasn't independent of party politics at the time. Poetic creativity, the sublime, had a strong political significance. The Tory writers, the royalist writers, were imitators. They imitated classical writers. Theirs was a craft. They saw themselves as members of the court, as Augustans, engaged in social and political commentary and satire. The Whig writers, the liberal writers, were melancholy, reclusive, looked like they were living in other worlds. They were enthralled by the ancient past, intoxicated with the powers of the imagination. And so we get the Whig intellectual, the Earl of Shaftesbury, describing how poetry is a divine, God-given activity. He says the poet is indeed a second maker, a just Prometheus. Remember, Prometheus stole fire. So the poet steals fire under Jove. Like that sovereign artist or universal plastic, that's palpable nature, he forms a whole, coherent and proportioned in itself, with due subjection and subordinacy of constituent parts. This sounds very like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, writing more than a century later. That the poet diffuses a tone and spirit of unity that blends and, as it were, fuses each into each by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. So the Romantic emphasis on originality and creativity, which you've all seen, I think, in Frankenstein, was directly derived from the previous century's politics of creativity, writing seen as a form of commerce, of entrepreneurship. In terms of Tolkien, while we might think of Fëanor, who created the Silmarils, as a Promethean artist-creator, similar to the Romantic genius, he also draws, therefore, on a much longer tradition, identifiable in Shaftesbury, also Neoplatonic thinking and philosophy, the tragic heroes of Shakespeare, of ancient Greece, and the covetous materialism in biblical parables of the New Testament. So this way of making the imagination powerful and creative is itself dramatically evident in the 18th century in the attention given to the sublime as an effect which is linked to freedom and lack of restraint and rebellion. So I hope you're sort of seeing how it overlaps now with the way in which the Gothic race were imagined politically. In fact, the first English version of Longinus's treatise on the sublime had appeared in 1652, in other words, just after the British Civil Wars, as the work of a Republican poet and writer. So even then, the idea of the sublime is being equated, it's being linked with Republican government and Commonwealth, in other words, with the extreme left wing of politics. And other critics have charted the relationship between poetic passion, originality, and the spontaneous in the work of later critics. So Burke's work on the sublime is supporting this Whig attitude towards politics and creativity, and that's what influences later writers. So the sublime, like the Gothic, is a political element of the period. Or to put it another way, the theory and practice of the sublime underlines and emphasises the political basis of the Gothic. And that, I would argue, runs deep in Tolkien's work. Now, the 7 types of obscurity I mentioned earlier might be summed up like this, and this is what I've derived from Burke, and I think that it applies to a lot of Gothic writing, and I'm going to look at it in particular in Tolkien's work. So we could have meteorological obscurity. In other words, mists, clouds, wind, rain, storm, tempest, smoke, darkness, shadows, and gloom. Gothic novels are sort of full of this bad weather, if you like. In Tolkien, we have obviously the misty mountains. We have mist on the road to Bucklebury Ferry. We have fog on the Barrow Downs. We have Weathertop and the storm there. The great darkness on the Plenary fields. Secondly, there's topographical obscurity. In other words, an obscure landscape. Impenetrable forests, inaccessible mountains, chasms, gorges, deserts, blasted heaths and moors, ice fields, or the boundless ocean. Again, those are elements that you'll recognise from your reading of Gothic novels. Tolkien, too, has this topographical obscurity. Mirkwood and the Old Forest, Caradhras, the Dead Marshes, Thangorodrim, and the idea of the uttermost west. Thirdly, architectural obscurity. In other words, buildings that complicate and make things difficult for characters. Towers, prisons, castles covered in gargoyles and ramparts, abbeys and priories, tombs, crypts, dungeons, ruins, graveyards, mazes, secret passages, locked doors. All of these are recognisable in Gothic novels. Many examples in Tolkien as well. Dol Guldur, where the necromancer is revealed to be Sauron. Minas Morgul, Barad-dûr, Sauron's great fortress. Angband, Moria, Orthanc, the Paths of the Dead, the Barrows, Shelob's Lair, the tunnels under the Misty Mountains, and so forth. Material obscurity. That would mean masks and veils, or disguises, or even suits of armour. The Nazgul, obviously, as well as Frodo travelling under an assumed name, Mr. Underhill. Strider, who is known as Aragorn and later Elessar. The elven cloaks of Lothlorien. Eowyn's disguise as Dernhelm. Frodo and Samwise disguised as orcs. Or in the Silmarillion, Beren and Luthien disguised as a werewolf and a vampire bat. Fifth would be textual obscurity, how the text itself entangles the reader or confuses the reader. Riddles, rumours, folklore, the use of unreadable manuscripts and inscriptions, broken texts, unfinished stories, unreliable narrators, and so forth. Stories within stories. Now, philology, invented languages, are of course at the heart of Tolkien's Middle-earth. In addition, he also has what you could call textual objects, textual artifacts. Thorin's map with the moon runes on it. The prophetic song, The King Beneath the Mountains, which is sung at Lake Town when the dwarves and Bilbo arrive. The inscription on the ring, which Frodo cannot read. The manuscript of Isildur that Gandalf discovers. The book of Mezabel, found in Moria. More complex examples would be the long, unfinished poems that Tolkien refers to, and the different languages and dialects of Middle-earth, and references in Lord of the Rings not only to the First Age, but also to Anglo-Saxon poetry and other sources. Spiritual obscurity would be another type. Religious mystery, allegory, symbolism, ritual, magic and the occult, Satanism, witchcraft, summonings and damnation. Now, this is a staple of Gothic fiction, particularly for those of you who have read The Monk, but perhaps offers less for the reader of Tolkien. Now, while there's certainly damnation and forms of magic being exercised, as well as some limited attention to burial rites. The supernatural is surprisingly downplayed. There's very little about religion or about forms or places of worship. Where are the churches in Middle-earth? Well, they're on Numenor. If anyone's read the Silmarillion is where the temples are built. But religion's a tricky area, and I'll return to that in my conclusion. And magic itself is pretty downplayed in Middle-earth. Sauron does change his shape, and the dragons have powers of bewitchment, as does Saruman. The two Watchers are the enchanted guardians of Cirith Ungol, but there isn't a great deal. And finally, psychological obscurity can be seen to characterize the Gothic novel. Dreams, visions, hallucinations, drugs, sleepwalking, madness, split personalities, mistaken identities, doubles, derangement, ghostly presences, forgetfulness, and hauntings. Now, obviously, there's plenty for Tolkien readers here. Prophetic dreams, the visions of the Plenary, which also enslaves users to the will of Sauron, the mirror of Galadriel, the shifts in perception caused by the ring, the split identities of Gollum, Smeagol, multi-named characters, derangement, the effect of the ring not only on its bearers, but also on other characters such as Boromir, ghosts, again, the ring wraiths, Barrow-wights, Oathbreakers, forgetfulness, as seen by the character Nienor in The Children of Húrin, and the distorted vision of Morgoth imposed on Húrin himself. Now, this long list I've just given is by no means definitive, and you could write on any of those topics, as well as other topics such as monstrosity, the dragon, the Watcher in the Water, Shelob, and so forth. But these forms of obscurity all aim at creating a sublime experience through mystification, through confusion, in order to think about the consequences of history and the telling of secrets. In other words, they're all tied to history. They're not existing independently. Let's take the last example. The devastating plot of The Children of Húrin, for those who've read it, is driven by exposing dreadful secrets in the revelation of the past, and that secret is incest. And so suggested by The Children of Húrin, the Gothic, through its fascination with gloom and ineffability, the license allowed to the imagination, and the tendency of the sublime to engage with violence and terror and horror, it becomes a way of exploring those forbidden subjects, of exploring incest, or confronting the ferocity of the French Revolution in the 1790s, or giving voice to panic about scientific advance in Frankenstein, or expressing revulsion over racism and slavery in a more recent novel such as Beloved by Toni Morrison. And Tolkien's own concerns fit these deeper currents in his heartfelt anxieties over the irrevocable rural and industrial change, over the deep struggles of national identity after the First and Second World Wars, and the dehumanizing effects of mechanized warfare, that being the major experience of the 20th century. Now, all this is seen most emphatically, I think, in the downfall of Numenor, the Akalabeth. It's a text dominated by his fear of death, of mortality, but also of progress and memory. From its founding, Numenor had a temple to Ilúvatar, at whose feet were built the tombs of the kings. And so death and memorialization are at the heart of the Numenorian identity. And the Numenorians valued learning, arts and crafts. They remained friends with the elves, who brought them songbirds and flowers and trees and herbs and corn and wine. But even so, they protested against their mortality and the prohibition against them visiting the undying land, as they thought they would become deathless if they could set foot on Valinor. Sauron fed their lust for immortal life. He corrupted 3 Numenorian kings into ring wraiths and beguiled the last king, Ar-Pharazôn. He converted the king to worship Morgoth, instructed him to build a huge domed temple with an altar of fire and to make human sacrifices. He inspired the Numenorians to become slavers, imperial capitalists, and he filled their land with fortresses, and temples and tombs, and even engines, mechanized engines. So just as Sauron and Saruman are tainted by technology, so the industrialization of Numenor in the Second Age is not depicted as progress, but as the triumph of a totalitarian evil. And it is ultimately catastrophic. Indeed, in The Lost Road, this Numenorian modernity, as Christopher Tolkien summarizes, amounts to the withdrawal of a besotted and aging king from public view, the unexplained disappearance of people unpopular with the government, informers, prisons, torture, secrecy, fear of the night, propaganda in the form of the rewriting of history, and the multiplication of weapons of war, including metal ships that travel without sails, fortifications, and missiles. So in other words, in other versions of Numenor, Tolkien's thinking very much about what's going on in the 1930s. That whole range of state terrorism, threat, incarceration, revising history, was as pressing to Tolkien as it was to a writer such as George Orwell. Orwell's response was to write 1984, the near-future dystopia, and Animal Farm, his allegory. Tolkien's response was to Gothicize fascism, to make fascism Gothic. It's also seen in his darkly humorous badge for the Mordor Special Mission Flying Corps. In other words, the Mordor Air Force. He hated the idea of aeroplanes being used in warfare. But this history is at the same time unquestionable. You can't escape it. Aragorn is a figure who comes bearing the weight of history to threaten Sauron. He's described by Éomer as a walking legend. He says, dreams and legends spring to life out of the grass. The hobbits too are fabled folk. Do we walk in legends? So those ideas of the past and repressed history turn out to be irrepressible. They can't be kept down. Even the Barrow Wights show that history may be entombed but refuses to die. And in having that undead agency, influence, they help to knit the plot of The Lord of the Rings together. The ancient blade with which Merry stabs the Lord of the Nazgul was actually forged, it was made, for precisely that reason, hundreds of years before, in the war against the Witch King of Angmar in the north. Similarly, the dwarves delved too deep in Moria and awoke a Balrog. In his earlier drafts for this episode, Tolkien described a Balrog as an avenger sent from Mordor, but he rewrote the passage to make the demon part of the hidden history of the mines. So in other words, it's already there, it's part of the untold history that then explodes. So history merges with the contemporary, and the shadow of the past is not only inescapable, but it defines the present. The elf Gildor points out to the hobbits as they're leaving the Shire that the Shire is not a country retreat, but is caught up in history too. The wide world, Gildor says, is all about you. You can fence yourselves in, but you cannot forever fence it out. Tolkien, in fact, said, I much prefer history, true or feigned, in other words, made up. Now, the explosion in popularity of the Gothic literary genre at the end of the 18th century is a familiar chapter in English literary history. But other things were happening in the 19th century as well. And the Gothic was not simply a cry of horror at social change. It was also very mainstream and an opposition to urbanisation and to industrial capitalism. So this is the Victorian Gothic revival movement, which was a deliberate return to medieval styles in architecture and culture. And it's seen most vividly in huge new building projects, such as the Palace of Westminster, designed by Augustus Welby Pugin. Also seen in the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and in William Morris's arts and crafts movement. And Tolkien admitted that he was influenced by William Morris. Now, this wide-ranging movement combined earlier researches into chivalry and behaviour, which interestingly blossomed most stirringly in this recreation of a medieval tournament in 1839. Combine that with the more extravagant building projects of Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill. So this became a visionary form of medievalism that produced both structurally sound buildings, but also a model for Christian living. So the Gothic became a pattern for rethinking, for redeveloping community relations in a Christian society. The practices of medieval craftsmen, building pointed arches and ribbed vaulting and flying buttresses, received an enthusiastic new lease of life. Now, in his own work, Pugin suggested that it was the social relations of medieval society that enabled them to produce their greatest works of cathedrals and abbeys. And in doing so, they spread their values of virtue. So corrupt societies, such as 19th century Britain, produced dismal architecture that alienated the people. In fact, in contrast, he contrasts them deliberately. That's the modern stuff, that's boring, it's sort of depressing, it's alienating. This is the medieval style, it's uplifting, it's engaging, it's Christian. So in other words, Pugin is arguing, if we adopt the latter, if we go back to raising the soul, we can come up with a better society. So the Gothic became, in the 19th century, by far the preferred style of architecture for schools and universities and churches. This had a problem at the heart of it, though. Understanding history in this way, as a progress, was already a Whig liberal narrative that had at its basis the defeat of the Middle Ages, and not just the Middle Ages, but the Catholic Middle Ages. Gothic was too much associated with liberal values of the Whigs, with parliamentarian values. It was also Protestant and profoundly anti-Catholic. In fact, the English Reformation was declared to be a repeat of the original 5th century Gothic rebellion against Roman tyranny. This time it was argued that it was standing against the Roman Catholic Church as opposed to imperial Rome. The executed monarch Charles I had strong Catholic sympathies, and after, in England, William of Orange took the throne, an act of settlement ensured that succession to the English throne would remain exclusively Protestant. That was the nature of the progress that the Whigs were advocating here. Of course, for Tolkien, this is doubly distressing. He was both a Catholic and a medievalist. So Tolkien doesn't write as Protestant writers did of the 18th and 19th centuries. They envisaged history as overcoming, as defeating, as replacing the Catholicism of the Middle Ages. Rather, Tolkien is writing as an active medievalist, seeking to reconnect and revive the old northern identities. And in this, he's actually in the tradition of other Catholic Gothicists. Richard Verstegen, for example, wrote A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence in 1605. This attempted to restore Germanic national origins and early Catholicism to the English identity through arguments based on philology and legendary evidence. And the parallels with Tolkien are very striking here. Edmund Burke, about whom I've spoken, the architect of the sublime, was also a political Gothicist in his reflections on the revolution in France. He was born in Ireland to a Catholic family, spent much of his time with his mother's Catholic family, despite being sent to the Protestant university there. He never forgot his deep roots in Catholicism. So, considering Tolkien's Middle-earth, I think this tradition of Catholic Gothicism reveals that The Lord of the Rings is a work of the Gothic revival, but particularly of Pugin's Gothic revival. Pugin, like Tolkien after him, was a Roman Catholic and deplored the English Reformation and the destruction that it had enacted upon medieval architecture and society and culture. So Pugin's aim was to revive medieval social structures, not as an expression of repressed guilt at the sometimes brutal course of progress, but because they were consistent with his faith, which was itself continuous with the Middle Ages. So he's aiming at continuity with the Catholic Middle Ages, unbroken by the Reformation. And Tolkien's Middle-earth is in the same tradition. Although Tolkien may have adopted many of the characteristics of Gothic novels, he did not write novels of terror or horror, but he investigates hospitality, chivalry, courage, social responsibility, and the challenges of progress in anxieties over rural and industrial transformation. It's also noticeable that the elements of the Gothic sublime that Tolkien does use are predominantly in The Lord of the Rings. There are far fewer in the Silmarillion, with the exception of the great tales of Beren and Luthien and Turin Turambar and the Akallabeth. Now this is because much of the Silmarillion concerns the plight of the elves, and elves are immortal. They do not have the same relationship with history as do the race of men, or indeed hobbits. So it's only when the focus is on men that Gothic motifs such as vampires and werewolves, doom and bewitchment, demonism and tyranny, and all the other Gothic paraphernalia become prominent. All of those spiritual and supernatural ways of disorientating or confusing the reader, the ways that are so beloved of Gothic novelists, are focused on the stories about men, because men have from Ilúvatar what is described as the gift of death. Death, in other words, Gothicizes time. This thing all things devours in the riddle game. And dying too, especially martyrdom, is much more akin to Catholic than Protestant accounts. Before he wrote The Restitution of Decayed Intelligence, Verstegen had produced a Catholic martyrology, the theatre of cruelty, that detailed the persecution of Catholics. These Catholic martyrs are distinct from the Protestant martyrs described by John Foxe in his Acts and Monuments. They're less forensic, more transcendent, hidden from witnesses, passing into another realm. The death of Boromir, which happens off stage, effectively, is a prime example. And finally, Tolkien's Catholic Gothicism even suggests a covert Jacobitism to kings and sovereignty. Two instances stand out. The song sung at Lake Town, "The King Beneath the Mountains Shall Come Into His Own," is based on a late 17th century ballad, "When the King Enjoys His Own Again," which is sung by royalist and Catholic rebels throughout the rebellions against the Protestant monarch, known as the Jacobite rebellions. Similarly, the destiny of Aragorn, summed up in the title of Volume 3, The Return of the King, allude to the restoration of Charles II after the Republican Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth. Tolkien did suggest different titles for his volumes, but The Return of the King was suggested from the outset. It's no coincidence. So for Tolkien, as for Verstegen and Pugin, and also for the 8th century monk, the Venerable Bede, the Goths were the earliest and Germanic Catholics. They're an alternative to classical paganism and to Protestantism. Tolkien said that the Gothic language had reached the eminence of liturgical use. In other words, the Lord's Prayer and various Gospels were translated, but failed owing to the tragic history of the Goths to become one of the liturgical languages of the West. That was because they adhered to the Arian heresy, which disputed the divinity of Christ. Robert Murray remembered in August 1973 that Ronald Tolkien, was maintaining with great vigour over the luncheon table that one of the greatest disasters of European history was the fact that the Goths turned Arian. But for that, their languages, just ready to become classical, would have been enriched not only with a great Bible version, but also, on Byzantine principles, with a vernacular liturgy, which would have served as a model for all Germanic peoples and would have given them a native Catholicism, in other words, a Gothic Mass, which would never break apart. And with that, he rose and in splendidly sonorous tones declaimed the Our Father in Gothic, which begins, Ata unser du in himmelum, reina namu thine. In 1952, Tolkien had recited this into a tape recorder to cast out any devils that were lurking within. Now, this is one of the very few properly Gothic texts that has survived, and it provided Tolkien with some of his elvish vocabulary. Ata, meaning father, coincides with the Quenya, the elvish word atar. Now, the fact that this literary and linguistic tradition had been almost completely lost was for Tolkien a tragedy, the tragedy of history. As he wrote shortly after the publication of The Return of the King, I am a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect history to be anything but a long defeat. Though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some examples or glimpses of final victory. The long defeat, that phrase repeats the haunting phrase used by Galadriel. Together, through the ages of the world, we have fought the long defeat. So that phrase binds together the Goths, the dissolution of English Catholicism, and the disenchantment of Middle-earth. But out of this defeat came the Gothic, imagined, created, and realised in Tolkien's own writing as a potential restoration of a renewed English national identity. Thank you.
Wow, this was quite a mouthful, Nick. I mean, you have illuminated us plenty here today, I think. Lots of new notions that I was not aware of that you brought up here today, and that I think would be, very, very interesting to discuss here at large. Nick has also mentioned, as you've heard, he has given many references to works that we have read in class, that we have seen, ideas on the sublime. We have discussed Frankenstein at some length. We looked at Keats and Burke and all the others, Coleridge. So, if you have any questions that you want to ask Nick, this is a golden opportunity now. We still have about 5 or 10 minutes that we can devote to questions. If anyone wants to ask Nick anything, feel free to do so.
Okay. Hello, Dr. Groom. Thank you for your presentation today. It's been a pleasure to hear you. I have a question about what you mentioned about the origins of Goths and all the Gothic influence that has been along all the history. I was thinking that you may suggest a relation between the Gothic and Nazism, maybe? The origin of Nazism and all that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly something that Tolkien himself was very concerned about. One of the things that Tolkien is trying to do, not only in his creative work, but also in his critical work, is to create an alternative cultural canon, one that's focused very much on ideas of the North, of northern literature, and of northern values. And he realised that the Nazi Party were doing something similar in Germany throughout the 1930s, partly by championing the work of Richard Wagner. So, although Tolkien certainly had an interest in Wagner, and Wagner was using similar sources, he worked to distance himself from Wagner. He famously said, the only thing that I share with Wagner is the fact that we each describe a ring and both rings around, as Thomas knows.
Which is not quite correct.
No, it's not correct. No,
He
no.
took the motive from Wagner about this kind of the power of the ring, which is not in the original Nordic sagas, and so that's why he was very so concerned that the Nazis also misused that. Indeed, exactly.
Yeah. On the other hand, he does. I mean, Wagner also downplays the role of women, and so Tolkien is very interested in the role of Guthrun, for example. But he was aware that his work ran the risk of being contaminated by that fascist ideology. And so that's one of the reasons I think that he's thinking about not only industrial and technological progress in Numenor, for example, but is also thinking about the effect that this has on social life and on politics. Now, in terms of how the Nazis used those Gothic myths, there is a different tradition in Germany, as there's a different tradition in Spain, and it'd be interesting, I think, over the course of the next day to think about whether the Spanish inheritance of the idea of the Gothic has any similarities to what's happened in England, and whether the German experience is comparable or not. I suppose finally you can argue that Tolkien does succeed in separating his version of the Gothic and also of Northern identity from the taint of Nazism, because look where we are now, and in that sense, we don't read Lord of the Rings and think that it's a sort of a crypto-Nazi novel. He has succeeded in redefining what that relationship would be, and I would suggest that it's through the Catholic Gothicist inheritance that he develops. Thank you. A challenging question.
Right. More questions? Anyone else in the audience?
I'm quite happy to talk over the next day or so as well, if anyone wants to talk, without having to talk in a big hall.
Exactly.
Which can be intimidating.
So also tomorrow we'll have an opportunity with the roundtable session to ask questions to Nick and to Thomas as well after his plenary talk as well. I was wondering, Nick, one of the things that I've come to learn throughout the course of this talk is that it seems like Tolkien is using the Gothic then to denounce progress in a way, but at the same time he is denouncing the Gothic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
At the same time,
Yeah.
This indulgence in the horror and not taking an active response against anything. This defeatism, in a way, right? So it seems to be contradictory because he says also that you're fighting the long defeat, and that's what we do. That's what he does as a Roman Catholic, conceiving of history as a long defeat. But at the same time, he urges people to fight against it, right?
Yeah,
so
it's very much what's sort of considered to be the credo of Northern courage at the end of the Battle of Maldon, that Tolkien alludes to in his radio play, The Homecoming of Beorhtnoth, Beorhthelm's son, which was actually broadcast, I think, in 1953, just as he was finishing The Lord of the Rings. And that is, the heart will be sterner, the will prouder, the spirit stronger, as our physical strength lessens. And so, the idea that you sort of keep fighting even though, defeat is inevitable.
Right.
And, I mean, The Lord of the Rings is one of the darkest novels of the 20th century. It is about defeat and loss, and the fact that, the world is a much lesser place at the end than it is at the beginning. I mean, destroying the ring isn't just about defeating Sauron, it's about dissolving Lothlorien and doing away with Rivendell. And all of the magic, all of the fairy, all of the enchantment goes. So it's what you're prepared to sacrifice in order to end up with, a better and more stable world.
Exactly.
You sometimes have to get rid of everything you love to prevent the thing that can't be allowed to happen.
Right, and he also hated, and he states this in a letter, that he hated Hitler for his misappropriation of this idea of the Northern courage to fight the long defeat, to fight. That was, in his sense, in his way of thinking, Hitler had misappropriated and misapplied this idea of Northern courage and making it forever accursed, he says in his letters.
And making it triumphalist as well, rather than having much more, that much sort of darker root.
So he wanted to rehabilitate the notion of the Northern courage through his work and putting it in a different light.
I think it's very interesting to think about that in terms of the posthumous works The Silmarillion is a very challenging work. It's best if you read the Silmarillion backwards. Start with the last bit on the third age and then read through it backwards. But in that, in the Children of Húrin, in Sigurd and Guthrum and so forth, you can see his attitudes changing, I think. But also, what we tend to forget with Tolkien is that he worked on these texts, in the most part, throughout his life. And it was a long life that was lived through epochal events, 2 world wars, for example, the aftermath of the world wars, rapidly changing society. So it's not like you can say, well, they're simply the product of a particular year and narrow experience. They actually take in a wealth of critical and creative thinking from across decades and decades. And that's why it's so difficult to get a good text of a work such as the Silmarillion, because he changed his mind about it. And he was interested in process rather than necessarily having a definitive text. Look at the History of Middle-earth volumes, which are a wonderful resource for that. You can see how radically things do change, and consequently get an insight into the structure and the possibilities of the text as it was eventually published.
Great. So, any final question, short question before we go on this coffee break? Anything that anyone wants to comment on, add, ask about? No? If not, I think this has been a riveting start for the conference, and it's touched upon many of the key issues that we will be debating throughout the conference here, especially taking on this diachronic perspective, looking at the different stages in the evolution of the ideas of nationhood and Gothic and so on and so forth. So now we will be having a short break, and at 6:30 we will be back here again so there's only about 5 minutes for this coffee break, I'm afraid. But at 6:30 we'll be starting again with the next session with a short film. But I want you to give a final applause to Nick and thank him again for coming here. Thank you very much.